The age of castles and the knight. So we're just going to give you some background. And I've mentioned this several times, and at this point I want you to really get this idea down, is that we have an area of fragmentation after the age of Charlemagne. There's no central king who actually has enough control. So this actually gives us heightened feudalism. We call it the feudalistic era, but it's really a heightening of already existing practices. Feudalism. Feudalism is a loyalty-based system. If you're European, you have it in your mythological DNA. It's a loyalty-based system. It's essentially at a time where you, as a knight, need to give your oaths to your direct lord. And you have to take those oaths very seriously because you probably live with that lord. The lord gives you gifts. You are brave for that lord or baron, not for the big king who you might never see. So feudalism has to do with the breakdown of society and tight personal affiliations. Loyalty-based system, baron over king. The baron is your local ruler, right? And the king is the big ruler. There are three types of people that live in a feudalistic environment, and this is often quoted by historians to simplify things. There are three types of people: those who pray, those who fought, and those who worked. Those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Those who fought were very important for protection and aggression. You really needed knights to protect your lands. Those who worked, those were the peasants, most people. Those were the highly exploited people, the masses. And those who pray, the church, anyone belonging to the church. They had so many functions at this time. They were teachers, tax collectors, they would work for kings. A church member might become a count, which a count is someone who worked for the big king and would oversee minor lands. If you ever wondered what a count is, it's like a federal worker instead of a state worker, if you want to look at it that way. And you have isolated, fortified castles, and I hope it makes sense why. They needed to be isolated, a lack of protection, a lack of unity. There wasn't this big army going around protecting everybody. Everybody had to have their own little army. So even as the age of prosperity occurs and we have a renewal in church and population, feudalism is still lingering on. There's still a lot of disunity in the land. Now at first, the knight, of course, begins one way, and by the end of the night, of being a knight, of being able to call yourself a knight, it changes definition. It becomes a totally different thing. Lord and land. So if you were a knight, you paid homage to a specific lord. And at first, when there was a lot less population, a lot more land to give, the lord would often give the knight, and this was usually the majority for what historians think to be true, is that a knight would be given a plot of land at first. As time went on, more and more knights, more and more population, less land, the knights weren't given land unless they were really special, like a son, that became a knight of the Lord. So knights would often just live inside the castle with the king. So at first, being a knight was basically how you become enfranchised. It's how you become someone. It's how you take in land without being a peasant, of course, which you don't want to do. So it's not only titles that are important in the beginning, it's actual assets, actual land. A knight would swear an oath to his lord. Paying homage is what it was called. Paying homage is sort of absolute fealty, absolute devotion to that lord. There's a big ritual, a public ritual when you first become a knight. You put your hands between your new lord's hands and kneel and say, "I am yours," and then they kiss, and then there's some other things that happen. And the knight, depending on what era you are in, the knight will spend a large amount of time on his belly praying. That's right, yeah, there were lords all over the place. There were so many we don't even have their names anymore. They were just everywhere. If you want to think of all the little towns around here, every little town would have its own lord and its own group of knights. And as soon as you leave Fulton and go into Ashland, you have a whole new group of knights to deal with. And they might not like the lord that you were raised under, so you might be taken for ransom or just killed or kidnapped or whatever. So in general, in the age of feudalism, the population was low enough that there was extra arable land. And then a little bit past our era, like right before the Black Plague, the population is way too much. way overburdensome. So just in the course of like from 1050 to the era of the plague, and that's not even, what, maybe just over 200 years, you get a major growth in population. So basically what that means is population is all over the place depending on where you are. It can grow fast, but it can shrink fast. But this is more, it's usually gauged in how much land is available, and there was a lot in the beginning of this era. The war horse and the stirrup. Without these two things, the knight as a sort of lightning unit, its main effectiveness in battle would not be possible. At the beginning, armor was a little bit lighter and the weapons were a little bit lighter, so you didn't need as powerful as a war horse, so they were a little bit smaller. And as time went on, as the armor got heavier and they began putting armor on the horses themselves, the horses that they began using look a little more like draft horses, not quite as large as a lot of your modern day draft horses. Like if we go out to the Budweiser Clydesdales in Boonville and see where they breed those, they wouldn't be near that size. But they were certainly much larger horses to carry the knight and his armor. The stirrup comes from nomadic raiders like the Huns, and the Romans actually got it. And so the stirrup has been around for quite a while. And innovations to the stirrup allow the knight to stay in place easier, to direct the horse, to stabilize himself in full armor. So the war horse and the stirrup are really at the crux of the effectiveness of a knight. And then that becomes really quickly overlooked once somebody starts talking about the knight. So do keep that in mind. The horse and the stirrup are primary. And then we'll just talk about weapons a little bit. But we'll start with armor. The newest innovation with armor is chainmail. I have some here on, actually. Chainmail is basically a bunch of ringlets of mail. You could have mainly a coat. You could have a very long coat or a short one like this. And there's also a headpiece known as a coif. A coif, C-O-I-F. Usually have an assistant help you put these on, but my squire grew up and went into accounting. So here's the coif. So here is your chainmail. Now look at this chainmail really close. Some of you might already know, what in the world would this be good for? Aside from like getting hit by lightning. What's this good for? Yeah. In general, what are the chains? Like, why this instead of... It can protect you a little bit from being pierced. It's not the best protection against piercing, usually plate mail or even just a thick leather. But the beauty of chainmail is you can't be cut with a slash motion, right? I can be stabbed. If the sword is heavy enough, it'll break right through the ringlets. But with a lighter sword, I can't be cut, or with a small knife. It just won't go through, all right? It just won't go through at all. So you can imagine these keep you from being sliced, all right? No problem. Very effective in it being sliced. Very, very, very effective. But it's light enough that you can wear another layer on top of it, which would be your plate mail. And your plate mail is more like a hammered metal, a flat metal. The term is quite nice because it has the description of it in it, plate mail. That's what you usually see when you see a knight. And this is plate mail right here. And that's just kind of a solid... Plate mail is what you usually see. You do see some chain mail here, though, tucked in. So when we talk about how the Greek was more heavily armored than the Persian, that's nothing compared to this. The Greek had greaves. They had a little arm plate, but yeah, the rest of this, not so much. Their helmet rarely had a visor. The visor slides up and down, and some claim that that's where we get the modern day Western salute, is lifting the visor. So the armor gives you layers of protection. The heavy armor now, with the knight, makes it so a basic arming sword, or a regular sword, is obsolete. Very, very obsolete. Now, if this is a really strong metal, and I get a running start, right, and I'm running at the person with plate mail, I might penetrate. I might, but the chances are the weapon's going to be totally ineffective. So armor now makes a whole plethora of things obsolete. So not only are they on a horse, it's really hard to get through that armor. More about weapons. Your sword had to evolve and become bigger and heavier. So over here, let's say this is your basic arming sword here. They developed a sword that was even longer and heavier called a long sword. That allows you to have more weight. You can go two-handed or one-handed with it. And then you get a great sword, otherwise known as a two-handed sword. This is the thing you see Conan the Barbarian with, but it's an awesome sword. It's like a claymore, right? A claymore from Scotland. And it's two-handed, and it's like huge. It's massive. I can wield one, no problem, but I've trained with them. And you just bash through the armor. So it's like sword slash axe because there's so much weight to it, right? So you're going to be swinging it around. Of course, there were berserkers who would swing it around with one hand. So the two-hander, these are getting bigger because they're battlefield weapons and they have armor in mind. But if you regress and you take that two-handed sword, take off the armor, and fight someone with this, you are now at a disadvantage if you have the two-handed sword. The armor is the missing link in that equation. So if somebody has a two-handed sword and I know anything about combat, I'll slice them up with their slow two-handed sword. If they catch me once, I'm probably not going to make it, but you know, that's just the way it is. So what else to say about swords? Let's move on. Spears are, one of your oldest weapons. The Greeks use it very successfully. The spear would be the most important weapon, as long as you acknowledge the idea that the spear evolves into the lance. The spear is one of the most inexpensive weapons to produce, especially a weapon with a tip. Peasants can use it easily, but also knights would use it. At first, when the idea of the European cavalry unit came about, they would have a little bit lighter spear, and then as time went on, the spear became heavier and turned into a lance. So if we have a spear, pretend there's a tip here, and I'm on a horse, at first the spear was often thrown, so you would have this arm position here. And then if you wanted to use the spear to not throw and just hit your opponent on the skull or what have you, didn't want to penetrate because you wouldn't get your spear back. But you're riding on the horse and you're using a extended arm position. As time went on, weight became more important. The way the war horses change, the knights change, and the weapons change, there's a combat innovation we often overlook, and that is that the lance is heavier, and so you're actually able to take out a unit quicker because you're heavier. So the lance develops from the spear. The lance is longer, heavier, and eventually they develop this little cap on it. And if you play video games, they'll often show the person putting their hand right behind that cap, right? Like a hilt on a sword. That's not what it was for. They changed the arm position so you're actually under the armpit. This gives you a lot more stability. So when you're on the back of a horse, if you actually they've done checks on velocity and penetration scientifically, and this is a much more stable position, so less energy travels back through my body when I hit. So you just gallop along and go, cloop, and they're gone. Then this little hilt cap thing evolved. It's not a hilt like a sword that you hold over the hand. You put it right in front of your shoulder. So there's even less energy traveling back through your body. Good way to dislocate your shoulder, but you'll win the jousting match. So this became the favored position that we see knights use in illustrations. But it started off more like this, all right? Being able to have that flexibility. But that's usually against someone who's on the ground, right? So as knights develop and there were more knights fighting each other, well, now it makes more sense. You're actually fighting another knight. So they go heavier, longer, bigger, and they're more concerned with going straight with that lance. So you see the evolution. There's a huge advantage when knights fight peasants. But when knights start fighting other knights, they have to evolve their skills. That's the lance. The mace here is a real basic weapon. It's a blunt weapon. It's just a club with a metal tip. This became fairly important. If you couldn't afford a sword, this would be good because you still can at least affect armor. You can still dent armor. If you get a headshot, you can knock the person out. If you knock the person out, they're yours. And then the axe, a heavy axe, all the weight is up here instead of through the blade of a sword. So yeah, an axe is very good against armor. Axe became very popular. More than the sword. Definitely, the sword was often secondary. A lot of people think of the sword as the most important weapon. And then the war hammer evolved. It's just a lighter hammer with a little pike end on the back. The beauty of the war hammer is that even though it's got the weight at the tip like a normal club, it's actually very slender and you can swing really fast with it. So it became at a certain point, it became preferred as a blunt weapon. Notice the pike on the back of this and this halberd. They're great for catching armor and pulling knights off horses or pulling down shields. This weapon is one of the first weapon innovations to help make the knight obsolete. You see pictures of knights and warriors with these giant pikes, like the Swiss Guard who guard the Pope in the Vatican. Those are a later innovation that were anti-knight in many ways. Because now with this polearm, you can use it as an axe, a spear, and a pike. Very effective against taking a knight off the horse. And then do what you want with the knight. Without the horse, the knight really isn't much. This is a halberd. There are many names for it, many variations. This is the most generic. A halberd. That's one of the tools that helped make the knight obsolete. There are others. When you think of knights fighting other knights, and this is part of the evolution of the knight, during combat, oftentimes if you dismounted a knight and you'd have a chance to kill the knight, you wouldn't do it. You would take the knight as hostage. Much better if you take a knight as hostage. Why? Because you get a ransom and you get prestige. And in a way, it keeps his friend from killing you when he's over you with a sword or pike or spear. It's sort of the code of the knight in a way. Take hostages on the battlefield. It becomes an almost delusional sort of warfare. So imagine hundreds of years go by and all these knights are accustomed to fighting each other and simply taking hostages, and they're up against a unit like the Huns. You know, they might not be quite psychologically equipped for what is about to happen if they're accustomed to being simply dismounted and taken hostage. So as the night goes on, knighthood becomes more abstract from its original function, and then eventually they just become a title of pride. Like it is now, you knight someone, you know, because they're a poet. You know, not because they've slaughtered your enemies, because they wrote some nice poetry. So taking knightly hostages was a thing with the knight. And eventually that sort of thing became obsolete. Chivalry. At first, being a knight in this fragmented realm, it was kind of glorious because you were kind of a minor nobleman generally. But being a knight and fighting other knights and going to war, it made a violent type. It made a violent psychology. Knights were not chivalrous in the beginning. They were rapists and plunderers. But eventually, as knights became not as important as a military unit, and the Pope became more powerful, you know, we know about the kind of reforming of the church, the renewal of the church that's happening after 1050, chivalry becomes something important. Not just a literature, but at a certain point it becomes important to the knight. And it's a code of conduct. So when you have a powerful lord who is hosting a tournament, let's say, and he's keeping a lot of knights in his castle, those knights are going to be highly competitive and violent against each other. But in the code of chivalry, you actually have a functional change where the lord is saying, oh, you must conduct yourself a certain way and save the violence for the tournament. So they didn't get rid of the violence. They just got rid of the chaotic violence. No longer happens. The violence is contained. And so the idea of tournaments become very, very important. Constantly hosting tournaments, letting the knights fight each other, but they can still practice chivalry. And as the 13th century approaches, women began attending tournaments. And fighting is a lot less violent. You're no longer allowed to fight with, say, sharp axes. You're now mainly relegated to the jousting arts. And so it's a code of refinement that helps curtail violence. Not unlike what happened with the Crusades around the same time periods. And so remember, in the Crusades, the Pope is trying to curtail violence in Europe. Get everybody together, create a truce of God. Let's create a truce, right? Let's not have Christians kill other Christians, unless they're Byzantine. Let's go kill Muslims. And then so all these violent knights, they're not worried because they won't be able to be violent anymore. They're happy because they will be able to be violent more, and it's justified. They might even be able to get to heaven because of it, because make no mistake, the Pope did frame the Crusades as if it was a holy war, and you would be given indulgences, meaning mainly you would spend less time in purgatory. We'll probably talk about purgatories during the Reformation. But anyway, along with chivalry, the knight became more honorable. Violence was contained. Ladies could be around, sort of thing. And attacking the neighbor castle and raping all the women wasn't necessarily the way to go. So a large amount of time had passed, and you get the idea of chanson du zeste. Chanson du zeste. It's a French word. Songs of heroic deeds. We get these epic knightly tales like the Song of Roland or the Charlemagne epics, which we still have today. We have like 120 of them that still remain. They're epic poems that talk about the heroic deeds of knights, often in Jerusalem, killing Muslims and that sort of thing. So these songs of heroic deeds, the troubadours would go around to various castles and marketplaces singing these things. And so it actually helped evolve the knight into a more chivalrous idea. They would have to be brave, but they protect other Christians. And so these songs reflected that. They channeled the violence. They didn't get rid of the violence. And I already talked about the religious fervor that channels war during the Crusades. Now remember when I said earlier on that lord and land, the lord would give land to the knight. And then eventually population grows and there's not as much land, good land. And so knights, there would be more knights and they would usually live with the king or lord or baron. As time went on, when the knights became more obsolete, they didn't serve at all. They just paid a tax. Scutage. S-C-U-T-A-G-E. It's a tax in place of service. So the role of the knight is steadily degrading. Lords begin to favor mercenaries. The knightly unit is part of a bigger unit now. You have archers, you have infantry that travel with the cavalry units. The cavalry units aren't alone and doing their own thing. They're now being organized as part of a whole, and they're becoming obsolete. And so lords actually began hiring mercenaries, and what's interesting is these mercenaries are often using these newer weapons that make the knight obsolete, like that long halberd there. And so when you see that happening, that's quite interesting. You have to pay mercenaries. So that mercenary, oftentimes infantry, it gives evidence that there are major changes in warfare and weaponry. And so then as the knight becomes obsolete, anti-knight weapons, as I put it. Tournaments evolved. At first, real early on, tournaments were a way of exercising your fighting ability. And people would often end up killed. They would use sharp weapons, axes. We see today jousting tournaments, but early tournaments, you could have a group of 100 men fighting another group of 100 men on a battlefield. But it's all for fun, it's not true war, but it's very close. And so you would have higher casualties than later on in the 13th century. You would have all sorts of interesting fighting scenarios. Like if you go to the SEA or some of these medieval combat clubs, they do some of this stuff now. They get 40, 50, 100 men on a field and women dressed in armor they've made themselves and weapons they've made themselves, and they just fight it out. More similar to early tournaments than what we often see portrayed in movies. So weapons like axes and swords, if they're using them in melee combat, then they're hammering out the edges and making them super dull eventually, right? So then the knight becomes less violent. And when you're jousting with a lance early on in a tournament, you would try to dismount your opponent. And that would often cause a huge amount of injury. It's dangerous enough just to ride horses. As time went on, tournament lances were made weaker. And the object became, how many lances can you break? Totally different, right? So you're just in heavy armor with a shield. You're not falling off your horse. The saddles are actually made a little higher and a little more sturdy at this time. You're actually just trying to break your lance on your opponent's shield without throwing them off their horse. And so by the end of the tournament, the more lances you have broken of your own lances, basically the more points that you get. So completely abstracted from the true violence that it once was into an abstract violence. So the idea of the knight, not just the physical violence, but also their own morality and place in the world becomes much more abstracted from that violence into today, where we knight poets. The Queen knights poets.